beginning? Oh, right, well, let's go to that point. I was going to show you a detail of the join between the Norman and the decorated, but here we're in what you will know as the Lady Chapel. And the interesting thing here in the Lady Chapel, you will see that it is apsidal. That is to say that it's like a semicircle at the far end. And you will see the mosaic at the top. And the mosaic at the top is Victorian and replaced the window that was originally there, which is now abutting the sacristy, which is effectively another chapel. And so therefore that window is of no use. That is why you have the window on the right, which was put up in the 14th century, about 1430. The mosaic that you see right in front of you is Victorian and is by Salviati of Venice. I think perhaps, would you care to let me have the next one? That's lovely. That's the west front, as many of us know, quite magnificent. But if you look at it, anybody who knows anything would say, yes, but it isn't Norman. And yet, of course, it basically is. How do we get around the problem? Well, the problem basically is that the window is far too big. And in fact, if you were able to see in the top left-hand corner, you would see 1686 as being when the window was originally put in, although the glass itself is Victorian. And what that is essentially saying is, what a magnificent person God is to be worshipped and admired and adored. But it's also saying, we, the Normans, built that. We too are the greatest. We too are magnificent. So don't you try it on with us. And you must have think that the Anglo-Saxons in their hovels would be deeply impressed by what they had seen. Now, I want you also to note, just look at it generally, because we're going to go on one, please. Can we go on one? That's it. And that's a reconstruction of what we think it was like originally. If you look at it, you will see that the amount of glass is far less. That's because the price of glass was ridiculously high. It was so high that if you were a very rich lord of the manor and you had 2 or 3 different castles, when you went from one castle to another in, shall we say, 1150, you'd take your glass with you. You imagine that you had a house down here and that you had a cottage up in Scotland. Oh, let's go up to Scotland for the weekend, dear. I'll just pack the glass before we go. It was like that. Now, if you look carefully, you will see that somehow or other, that looks a little narrower than the original. And it looks a little narrower because there are 7 arches. But if you look there now, there are 6. And that tells us that the bottom bit underneath the window was replaced. And indeed, this is fairly obvious if you bother to go and have a look at the corbels down there, a corbel either side of the main door, one of which has got a Victorian vicar, the other side has got another Victorian vicar who eventually became Archdeacon of Bristol. I think that's all I need to say, save one other thing. That if you happen to ever have the privilege of going up inside the Abbey, at the west end there, it becomes obvious that at one stage they were seriously thinking of building 2 towers, so that it became to look like a bit like Westminster Abbey or York Minster. But we don't know quite what happened. Did they run out of money? I mean, the cost must have been phenomenal. Did they run out of money? Did they run out of expertise? Or was it some other reason that we don't know about? Here we have a view of the tower itself. Now, if you go to several large parish churches that are basically Norman, you will see that the tower goes up as far as the clock. Just above the clock, you can see what's called a string course running down each side of the tower. And that shows us that the basic tower was built by about 1115. So the top part, you can see, is much more decorated. It's much more, the stone is of higher quality. And that was built by the first Earl of Gloucester, the second Lord after Robert Fitzhamon. It was built by Robert Fitzroy, the eldest bastard son of Henry I. Perhaps I ought to say here that Henry I was quite a lad, and he sort of zoomed around the countryside and had quite a lot of family that weren't actually recognised by anybody. His eldest son, called Robert, it was thought a good idea that he take over the honour of Tewkesbury, because under Robert Fitzhamon its lands had spread right down to the Bristol Channel, and Henry I thought, want to keep this in the family, please, and so therefore he put his bastard son in with a title, and he was the first Earl of Gloucester. And that's why when you go to Tewkesbury Abbey, you will forever be seeing Earl of Gloucester this or that, because there was a whole succession of them who took on that title when they took over the lordship of the honour of Tewkesbury. And it is said of that tower, but before I say that, I will say that the pinnacles at the top were add-ons later, as were the battlements in 1599, possibly in 1600. But it has been said of that tower that it is the finest Romanesque tower still in existence, not in England, nor yet in Britain, but in Europe. So it's a tower to be prized. Let's pass on. This is what is colloquially known as the Roman. Oh, gracious me! It is supposed to be a Roman plaque. Let's put it that way. It's one of the Abbey's mysteries. It's to be found on the north transept, west wall, about 2/3 of the way up. The panel's been identified as being Romano-British, it is thought. The scene depicts, it's not known, doesn't appear to be Christian. Norman builders were known to use useful items that came to hand, but as yet no one has been able to identify the scene nor where it came from, although it appears local. Recently, the thought has been aired that it could possibly marking where the original Anglo-Saxon church was, because it is believed that prior to the Abbey there was a small Anglo-Saxon church there, which was noted in the Domesday Book. Let's move on, please. Here's the north door. Now, you and I, when we go to the Abbey, almost always use it. The wooden doors may well be original, but we cannot say with certainty until a dendrochronologist has tested them. Now, you can't see it, but just to the left-hand side of that entrance is a cross in the stone, and it may be a consecration cross. The ceiling, which you can just see, is what is known as barrel vaulting and is made of wood and a form of plastering. And have a good look at that, because that's relevant when we look at one or two other things in a moment. Just above the door, immediately above the door, is what we call a tympanum. And that tympanum is usually highly decorated. But in this instance, it's not. And we have never quite discovered why they were so miserly with regard to that. So that is the north door. Let's move in then to the next one. And here, of course, is the interior that you and I know so well. Now, you will remember that you saw a moment or two ago barrel vaulting. Well, the whole of that was barrel vaulted, and it wasn't until the 1330s that Leone vaulting was put into place. And you can just see at the top there windows at the very top, and those windows only came in with that Leone vaulting. And that is known as the clerestory or clear story. Could we move on one, please? That is the reconstruction. That is how it would have looked if we'd gone in 1200 or something like that. No clerestory, no height to the point that we see it today. Yes, those 14 pillars are there, and yes, you may be startled to know that because of the water table, and you and I know that that water table is pretty high, the foundations only go down about a metre and a half. And so you say to yourself, my goodness me, they must have been remarkable builders if they can put that up, and it stands up for 900 years on foundations that are that flimsy. My admiration for their building ability knows no ends. It has been pointed out that it was probably quite a cunning thing to put in the Leone vaulting, which we saw earlier, because the weight goes straight down through the pillars rather than at the side. And that could be the reason why they still are so upright, even though the weight of the Leone vaulting is considerably greater than that barrel vaulting that you're looking at now. Shall we move on, please? This is a reconstruction again of the east end before the high altar. A reconstruction of how the east end might have looked, shall we say, in the 13th century. Note how the whole construction around and behind the high altar, it seems to be a bit fussy almost. The painting on the pillars are conjectural, but are likely to have been there, although perhaps not of the figures that you see. There would have been an ambulatory, that's a place for walking round, behind the high altar, but possibly not as wide as it is now. Okay, let's move on, please. There it is now. Look at the contrast. Look at the windows. Huge contrast to what we understand it was originally. Can we move on then, please? We saw that a few moments ago, and with a bit of luck, if we're very careful, the next one will show us a fraction of that. Now, the reason why I want you to look at that fraction of the Samson Pontificale is because if you look in at the top, the red and the green are what the bishop would say. Below that, in black, is where the monks would come in. And if you look very carefully, can you see that there are very dark strokes going up and down? Can you see those? Yes? Not very easily, I know, but even if you had it slap bang in front of you, you wouldn't see them too easily. But it looks as though somebody's been squiggling, doesn't it, just above those black lines. And in fact, that is musical notation. the very earliest musical notation. You are looking at the dawn of music as it is written, and that was to help the monks do the plainsong chants. And so therefore, that really is valuable in the sense that it gives us a good idea of how this was achieved. And from that, you see, the next stage was to have staves going across. And from the staves, you then got notes, and from that, you got different sorts of notes. But that's how it started. Let's move on, please. Now, this is somewhat different. It's Sir Guy de Brion, and it's up near the East End. And for those of you who are into such things, people drool over that particular tomb as they do over the one opposite. This cenotaph, it was originally supposed to be a tomb, dates from about 1400. And Sir Guy de Brion was a Devon landover, military and naval commander, diplomat and administrator of his day. He fought at King Edward III's, he was King Edward III's standard bearer at the Battle of Crecy in 1346 in the 100 Years' War. He was I sum him up as being a sort of 14th century Earl Mountbatten who took on major roles in a variety of spheres. His generosity contributed to the vaulting below the Abbey Tower. And he died, ladies and gentlemen, a great rarity for knights in armour. He died in his bed, aged over 70, which was a considerable age. However, his body was claimed by his estate at Slapton in South Devon, which is where he's buried. Here in the Abbey, his cenotaph, which was to have been his tomb, and get this, ladies, is opposite the tomb of Elizabeth Montacute. Sir Guy was her third husband. She has her second husband, Hugh the Third Dispenser, on her right hand. It's not many ladies, I think, who have memorials to husbands either side of them. Spare a thought for Giles, Lord de Badlesmere, who was Elizabeth's first husband, but who died rather young. Let's move on to the Abbot Wakeman tomb. One or two curiosities about this tomb. I'm sure if you've ever been in the Abbey, you've probably come across it. First, it's incomplete. You would expect the mortal remains to be on the bottom, and Bishop Wakeman, as he was by the time he died, to be clothed in his full ecclesiastical finery on the top. There are some experts who maintain that the tomb itself is too early in style for the bishop, in which case question, who on earth is the guy lying down there? Thirdly, the body part doesn't quite fit, and further interest is in the graffiti. This side, sort of the bit nearest to you, which people can get at easily, further interest is in the graffiti that is certainly late medieval and mostly Marian in subject. Let's move on. Here, of course, is the Duke and Duchess of Clarence vault, the only below ground part of the Abbey. Isabel was a Neville, but her grandfather was a Beauchamp, and she was directly descended from the Despensers. It was through her that her husband George, Duke of Clarence KG, inherited and became Lord of the Honour of Tewkesbury. Isabel died in December 1476 and was put in the vault. Within 14 months, the Duke joined her. He'd been killed, some would say murdered, in February 1478 by his brother, King Edward IV, for several acts of disloyalty. It's not clear how true the tradition is that he was drowned in a butt of Malmsey wine while a prisoner in the Tower of London. Can we now turn to the next one, please? This is Hugh II Dispenser under Abbot Coates. At least the partial remains of Hugh II Dispenser are contained in the bottom of this tomb. He was a somewhat grasping and unpleasant favourite of King Edward II, who was hung, drawn and quartered at Hereford in 1326. Parts of his body were displayed for a year at places as far apart as Dover, Bristol, London and York. His remarkable widow, Eleanor de Clare, you imagine this, ladies, received permission to remove those parts of his body still on display a year later. Gathering them, she had them interred at this spot. It is thought that there may have been a stone statue of him, but much was swept away in the 17th century, and Hugh Dispenser's place was usurped by the Purbeck marble coffin of Abbot John Coates. And he was the abbot. During his time, most of the changes at the east end and to the ceiling of the nave were carried out. Recently, these two tombs were in the news when the pop singer Will Young was featured in Who Do You Think You Are? And his genealogy was traced back to Hugh II Dispenser. The Abbey currently has a board by the tomb setting out that link between Will Young and Hugh II Dispenser and the latter's grim death. Such is fame. Let's move to the sacristy door. The back of this door is fascinating. It's said to consist of recycled items from the Battle of Tewkesbury. The door is definitely metal. 3 theories. The first is that it's made of armour of soldiers slain in battle. Second theory, it's the armour of horses slain in battle. And the third, metal taken from the bands that held the wheels together of the Lancastrian camp followers' wagons. Get a few experts together, get 2 experts and you get 3 opinions. None of them can agree what it is. And I quite often get people to actually just feel the metal. It feels very coarse. And your guess is as good as anybody else's. Let's move on to the Chantry Chapel. This is, before we go, this is inside the sacristy, and this window is made up of bits. They're made up of bits of the 7 windows, the 7 glorious windows that are in the choir. And they didn't like getting rid of them, so they said, well, let's make a window of it and put it in the sacristy. And so if you look at the sacristy window, you look at it and then you take a second look and then you take a third look, and none of it makes any sense at all. So good luck. Next, please. Here we are in the Trinity Chantry Chapel. This was Lord Edward Dispenser's Chantry Chapel. And I want you to note 2 things. First, on the left-hand side, the medieval drawing that's been painstakingly worked on to make it better. It was in a rather sorry state. And to either side of that figure of Christ, it can be seen Edward Dispenser on one side and his wife on the other. Turning to the right-hand side, you see that fan vaulting, which beats by a whisker those in an absolutely fabulous cloister in Gloucester Cathedral. And it is said that this was the tryout of the fan vaulting before they went to Gloucester Cathedral. And it is also said that this is the first example of fan vaulting in the country. Let's move on, please. Now this I've put this in because Abbot Allen doesn't really get the recognition that he deserves to get. He was the first abbot to be buried in the abbey. His is an early English type tomb. It's the only one in the Abbey. The reason why I rate him so highly is that he was a man held in high regard during his lifetime because of his personal integrity. He was the first, as I say, he was the first to be buried in the Abbey, and his is the only one to be in that particular style. Let's move on, please. And this is Thomas Collins's window and his plaque. And you will remember that it's in the west wall of the Lady Chapel. Thomas Collins lived from 1818 to 1900. He was a Tewkesburyan, self-made man who began work as an apprentice stonemason. But he was gifted with a business brain. And by the time he died, it's said that he had 400 men working for him. A lifelong committed Methodist, he loved the Abbey. Under the direction of Sir George Gilbert Scott, he was largely responsible for driving and delivering the reordering and restoration of the Abbey, especially in the late 1870s and 1880s, often generously funding the cost of the work programme himself. And the memorial window, immediately above the plaque, but to the left here, is in the decorated style by Powell of Blackfriars in London. Near the base of the window are the heraldic arms of the De Clares, the sees of both Gloucester and Worcester, and the arms of Tewkesbury Abbey itself. And if we move on, this is to be seen just above what's called the sedilia, the priest seats, at the very head of the nave. And this particular royal coat of arms are the arms of Charles II. A proclamation requiring churches to put up the royal arms was made immediately after the restoration of the monarchy in 1660. And so the Abbey, wanting to curry favour, made sure that it was there, and not just there, it was easily seen. If we then move to the organ, this magnificent instrument was originally built in 1631 by Richard Dallon, a grandfather of the famous organ builder Renatus Harris, for Magdalen College, Oxford, where the diarist John Evelyn apparently heard it played. It was dismantled during the 1650s and re-erected at Hampton Court Palace, where it was heard and possibly played on by the poet John Milton, which is why it's called, yes, you've guessed it, the Milton organ. It was nowhere near the magnificent instrument that you see today, and it was dismantled and returned to Magdalen College in 1660. It was sold to Tewkesbury Abbey in 1737 and was sited at the head of the nave. In 1849, it was developed considerably by a very young Henry Willis. A second swell manual had already been added. Willis explained the number of stops and added a pedal organ. The organ has been moved and expanded several times since then, and it was given its present position in 1887, but was raised several feet in 1997 at the end of a considerable overhaul. Today it has 4 manuals, that's 4 lots of keys, a pedal board, 68 stops. Well, if you think that most organs that you see in a village church, you're lucky if you've got a dozen, 68 stops and 4,611 pipes. I can't say for sure because I've not counted them personally. The upper organ case facing the choir, which you can still see there on the left, is by Robert Dallon and goes back to 1631. And it was built by the original builder. The organ case facing the Lady Chapel is by Thomas Swearbrook, who is an 18th century organ builder. The choir itself, which is what you're looking at, are the the choir screen and rood are at the west end of the choir. They were given in 1892, designed by Aldred Scott, son of Sir Gilbert Scott, the architect. The figures on the rood screen were carved by a gentleman called R.L. Bolton of Cheltenham. Immediately underneath the tower, it would have been possible to look up into the lantern, so called because it gave natural light to an otherwise dark part of the abbey. Originally, long bell ropes would have reached to the ground so that the bells could be rung. However, this whole area was covered over between 1330 and 1350 as part of the scheme of remodelling initiated by Eleanor Despenser in and around 1320 or so. Her great-nephew, Lord Edward Despenser, perhaps better known as the Kneeling Knight, would have helped on this one, as well as her son, Hugh III Despenser. The part under the tower also owes a great deal to the generosity of Sir Guy de Brion, as I said, known as Lord Bryan, who paid for much of that particular work. Between the two sets of choir stalls on the floor is the brass memorial to Edward, the Lancastrian Prince of Wales, who was killed at or soon after the Battle of Tewkesbury. Was that the spot where he was interred? Probably not. There is a suggestion that he was interred roughly between where the pulpit is, just on the right, and the present screen. And so we come to, I think, the last. The 7 windows. This has to be the greatest jewel that the Abbey possesses. The 7 windows overlooking the choir and presbytery contain some of the finest examples there are of mid-14th century stained glass, although there have been several restorations over the years, some better than others. It is more than probable that the instigator was Eleanor Despenser, née Declare, Hugh II Despenser's widow. Hugh was lord of the manor of Markley in Worcestershire, and the Witchenford Local History Group drew my attention to the fact that Hugh and Eleanor decorated the south chancel window of St. Peter's Parish Church, Markley, with emblems from the Declare and Despenser coats of arms. Did Eleanor gain her inspiration for the Tewkesbury East End from there? The east window in the Abbey represents the Last Judgment. In the centre is Christ himself, on his right the Blessed Virgin Mary, and on his left the Archangel Michael. Underneath, the dead are summoned from their graves. On the extreme right is the naked kneeling figure of Lady Eleanor, and you can see blown up a picture of that. In the immediate side windows are the Apostles and St. John Baptist. Lady Eleanor is pointing to the where Christ is, and if you know the hymn, "Just as I am without one plea," says it all. What she's saying is, I may be probably the richest person, richest woman in the country, bar the Queen, but I know that I am nothing in Christ's judgment. There is a tradition too, although I haven't been able to run it to its source, that the particular hue of the colour green being used is peculiar to Tewkesbury Abbey. How true this is, I have been unable to verify. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope that you wish to do your own research. There's loads to be done. May I draw your attention to 2 books, of course. One is my Celebrating 900 Years History of the Abbey, which costs you just a mere 20 quid. And the second, the Guidebook to the Abbey, which I also compiled at a mere £7, with lots and lots of the kinds of photos that you have seen this evening. You'll be delighted to know that due to the wonders of science, we can take your card and we can do the necessary even here for you, so you don't actually have to produce cash. Both benefit from the remarkable award-winning talent of Jack Bosket, a photographer that many of you will know and whose talent is just phenomenal. In both cases, all profits go direct to the Abbey, as neither Jack nor I benefit monetarily from any sales. Thank you for your patience. You have been incredibly patient, and I apologise for having taken quite so long. So thank you.